The date is unremarkable, a Tuesday. The location, however, is one of the most contested waterways on the planet. Somewhere in the northern Arabian Sea, a merchant vessel plods along a standard shipping lane. To any watch officer on a nearby bridge, or to an analyst scanning satellite imagery thousands of miles away, she is utterly unremarkable. A rust-streaked hull, a foreign flag barely moving in the limp air, a name painted on her stern that suggests she is carrying crude oil or maybe containerized goods from a port you have never heard of. She is a ghost, a silhouette, just another data point on a crowded radar screen. Inside her holds, there is no oil. There are no containers. Inside, there is a kill chain. For weeks, the intelligence briefings had warned of the threat. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, unable to match the United States Navy ship for ship, had perfected a doctrine of swarm warfare. From hidden coves along the Iranian coastline, they would launch coordinated attacks. Dozens of small, agile speedboats, the Ashura class, capable of hitting 60 knots, packed with machine guns or rockets. Above them, the sky would fill with the droning menace of Shahed 136 loitering munitions, their delta wings carrying high explosive warheads straight into the superstructure of a billion-dollar destroyer. The strategy is elegant in its brutality. Overwhelm the Aegis combat system with more targets than it can track, saturate the defenses, and let the math of cost disparity do the rest. A swarm costing a few $100,000 could, in theory, cripple a vessel worth $13 billion. But this particular tanker is not a target. She is the trap. As the first wave of Iranian fast boats detaches from the coast and races toward the horizon, their radar signatures merging into a single, terrifying bloom on the American screens, the tanker begins to change. Concealed hatches slide open along her decks. Behind panels that looked like rusted steel, there are no bulkheads, only cannons. The 30mm close-in weapon systems emerge, their multi-barreled rotors gleaming in the harsh sun. On her communications mast, arrays that appeared to be standard commercial antennas begin to pulse with a different kind of energy. They are jammers, designed to sever the remote control link between the shore and the incoming drones. The ghost ship has just become a warship, and the hunters are about to become the hunted. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. This is not a new story. In fact, it is one of the oldest tricks in the Naval Handbook, a deception so audacious that it feels like it belongs to an age of cutlasses and broadsides rather than hypersonic missiles and digital fire control. To understand what is happening in the Gulf today, we have to go back over a century to the gray waters of the North Atlantic and to the desperate ingenuity of the Royal Navy. We have to talk about the Q ship. The problem facing the British Admiralty in 1915 was, in its abstract form, nearly identical to the one facing CENTCOM today. Imperial Germany had unleashed its U-boats on Allied shipping in a campaign of unrestricted warfare. The submarine was the drone of its day, a cheap, stealthy platform that could sink a multi-million-pound battleship or a vital cargo vessel with a single, well-placed torpedo. The Royal Navy, the most powerful maritime force the world had ever seen, found itself largely powerless against this new asymmetric threat. They could not be everywhere at once. Convoys, the traditional defense, were initially resisted by the Admiralty, who saw them as defensive and cumbersome. They needed an offensive weapon. They needed to go hunting. The solution was born in secret. The Admiralty's code name for the project was Q. Q ships, or mystery ships as they were sometimes called, were ordinary merchant vessels, tramp steamers, schooners, even fishing trawlers that were covertly armed with concealed guns. The concept was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. A Q ship would sail alone, appearing vulnerable, a straggler begging to be picked off. The logic relied on understanding the enemy's behavior. U-boat commanders, with a limited supply of torpedoes and a taste for prize money, preferred to surface and use their deck gun. They would order the merchantman to stop, often firing a warning shot across her bow. Then they would close in, preparing to board and inspect the vessel before scuttling it. And that is when the trap would spring. On June 24, 1915, HMS Prince Charles, under the command of Lieutenant Mark Wardlaw, was patrolling off the coast of Scotland. A periscope was spotted. The ship, appearing to be a small defenseless collier, played her part perfectly, continuing on her course as if oblivious. The U-boat, U-36, surfaced and began to maneuver into position to attack. Wardlaw gave the order. The concealed gun ports on the HMS Prince Charles flew open. The white ensign was run up the mast to signify her true identity as a Royal Navy vessel, and her guns opened fire. U-36 was hit repeatedly and sank within minutes, becoming the first confirmed kill by a Q ship. It was a triumph of deception, and it set the template for dozens of subsequent engagements. The crews of these ships were actors as much as sailors. They perfected the panic party, a rehearsed drill where part of the crew would dramatically abandon ship in a lifeboat, screaming and shouting to convince the U-boat commander that the vessel was truly terrified and harmless. Meanwhile, the remaining gunners would crouch in silence behind the fake bulwarks, waiting for the precise moment to strike. The most famous of these traps, perhaps, was the action involving HMS Farnborough in 1917, when she engaged and sank U-83. The U-boat had been lured in by the abandoned ship ruse, only to be met by a wall of fire from the ship's hidden 4-inch guns. But for all their dramatic success, the Q-ships were not a war-winning weapon in purely statistical terms. Out of roughly 200 Q-ships deployed during the Great War, they were responsible for sinking only 14 U-boats and damaging perhaps 60 others. 27 of the decoy ships themselves were lost. They accounted for only 10% of all German submarines destroyed. Yet their value was never solely about the body count. The psychological impact on the German U-boat arm was immense. The U-boat crews, who once felt invincible while surfaced, suddenly had to fear every harmless-looking tramp steamer they encountered. The certainty of safety was gone. The Q-ships introduced paranoia into the German ranks. They forced a change in tactics, making U-boat commanders more cautious, more likely to stay submerged and use expensive torpedoes from a distance, which reduced their effectiveness and endurance. The fear of the trap became a weapon in itself. By the Second World War, the concept was revived, though with considerably less success. The British Navy, alongside the United States Navy, converted a handful of vessels into Q-ships. The Americans launched Project LQ, converting vessels like the USS Attic and USS Asterion. The results were, to put it charitably, dismal. On June 27, 1942, the USS Attic was patrolling off the coast of Virginia when she encountered U-123. The German commander, Hartigan, was suspicious. The ship's behavior was too perfect, too tempting. He decided to attack without surfacing, firing a torpedo that struck the Attic. As the ship began to sink, her hidden guns were revealed, but it was too late. The Attic went down with all hands, a stark reminder that in the game of deception, the cost of failure is absolute. The Q-ship had lost the element of surprise, and by 1943, most Allied decoy operations were wound down. The age of the drone and the missile had not yet arrived, but the age of the simple ambush was already fading. Or so it seemed. The reason this history matters today, the reason we are telling you this story, is because the Q-ship has returned. Not as a rusting steamer with a 4-inch gun, but as a modern, digitized, and devastatingly effective weapon of war. And it's not just the Americans who have revived the concept. In fact, it was the Iranians who first signaled its return. In 2024, the world took notice of a peculiar vessel in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the Shahid Mahdavi.
Here was a vessel that had begun its life as a purely civil container ship, a 700-foot-long behemoth designed to haul boxes across the ocean. But somewhere in its conversion, it had sprouted features no container ship should possess. Beneath its decks, it was equipped to launch Desfool medium-range ballistic missiles, weapons capable of striking targets over 600 miles away. Analysts immediately drew the comparison. This was a Q ship for the missile age. The Islamic Republic, unable to build large, sophisticated warships, instead had taken an existing commercial hull and turned it into a mobile, stealthy missile platform. Painted a menacing naval gray, it could lurk in the busy shipping lanes of the Persian Gulf, indistinguishable from its legitimate counterparts, until the moment it chose to unmask its weapons and strike. It was the old concept inverted. Instead of luring submarines, it was designed to deliver